I'm the last person to talk after such fascinating talk, so this is a real challenge, and all that in 15 minutes. I'm supposed to go over the whole Middle East, but mainly I would like to just tell you that, you know, it's like a human being who has so many risk effects and so many diseases. So when we talk about the risks, they don't seem interested, but when we talk about the diseases, they say, oh, we're not really surprised. At any rate, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share the truth with you. There is policy, but there are also various issues. But on the negative side, there are also unprecedented threats that we face. Now, let's talk with the terror in Israel. There was a terrible failure just a very short while ago when we didn't actually succeed in dealing with the various issues of suicide bombers. Now, bottom line, the summer has passed and there weren't any suicide bombs. Yes, there were people who come up in the morning motivated and they carry out terror attacks and stab people, but it's nothing similar to what we suffered 10 years ago, and that is definitely a success of our intelligence and our security forces, who have burned the midnight oil in order to work, follow things, and it is a success. And maybe it sounds as if I'm showing off, but that is definitely what has happened, and that is in contradiction to the attempts to organize themselves. If we're talking about 100 Hamas terrorists, there were 95, in fact, to be accurate. But perhaps one didn't even notice that. They were planning a whole model of various terror attacks, and they were actually detained, and they were, by the way, activated from Turkey, which then in itself seems bizarre. And they had planned actually as a bonus to also assassinate Abu Mazen. It doesn't only concentrated in the Gaza Strip. They've got strategic plans, and they have no intention to start negotiations. And forgive me, but ideologically, they say things honestly. They speak about Blair, peace, and initiatives, but absolutely no basis to all this. They've mentioned it, the people who spoke before that. We can't go into the nitty-gritty, but there's no chance that they're going to negotiate with you. They're only willing to give you some kind of temporal various decisions, and the moment that ceasefire, as it is called, ends. Yes, it was once said the ceasefire ended. Why? Because they felt that they had a little opening or something. But at any rate, why do we not negotiate with them? You can negotiate, but in our modern contemporary times, in order to get married, you still need a spouse, don't you need? And unfortunately, that spouse does not exist in this situation of negotiations. Now, in addition to that, the tough situation with the Hamas is that they're very determined to rid everyone of the Palestinian Authority, and if they could actually create a new Muslim Brotherhood regime, they would be much happier. And whatever happened in Egypt, it went by sort of quite quietly. I mean, Sisi, I don't want to actually risk anything by supporting it, but his decision, who was appointed as the Minister of Defense, and he was appointed and saved Egypt from the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, was a true victory. And their vision was that they would eradicate literally Israel. Since 1948 it's existed. They wanted to overpower the ginormous Egyptian army. We're talking about people from all strata of the population, and President Sisi decided to expel them, and he fought them in any possible manner. And the bad news is that in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood have not ceded their desires and their wishes, and there's there's a new mutation of the Al-Qaeda movement, and they find, and this terror organization is now in Sinai, and it has implications on Israel. But the good news is that they're not active as yet, but the bad news is that they're very strong, and they're supported by ISIS from Iraq, and they have a plethora of resources. They want to conclude their service and their objectives. Now, the head of the Southern Command spoke here, Major General Turjaman, and they say that the Hamas has various theories. Yes, we ought to rid us of them, and yes, from a military point of view, it's relatively easy. And believe me, when I was there were about 250,000 now. You can imagine the dense population there, and from a professional point of view, things are simply not working there. But what I suggest is that, you have to choose the right option for that specific moment. The Hamas at the moment, its motivation has not changed. Not only smuggling warfare, they've continued. They don't succeed in doing it in the quantity and the scope that they would like to, because the Egyptians have declared a war against them. Why? Because they understand that this is also anti-Egyptian regime, so they're very careful and cautious about them. Iran is having difficulty sending warfare, and even Sudan has changed its conduct and is now not smiling as an accomplice to Hamas anymore. In other words, it's much tougher for them, and their capabilities that are a tool for fulfilling their dreams are much harder to be substantiated. They can't make their dreams come true. We said that in the winter, they said that there's going to be a hot summer and that the deterrence will collapse. Well, thank goodness it didn't happen. There's still a threat. They're dealing in building tunnels and smuggling warfare and actually building up their caches and their arsenals. But you need to prioritize them by giving some kind of policy, by doing something. You can't do it in one fell swoop, but slowly but surely one has to change policies and adapt them in accordance. Now, in addition to that, I'd like to mention Egypt. If we talk about a development that we can't go into the detail about it, but the actual strategic security defense between Iraq and Jordan is actually our security area. So the Hashemite kingdom is fighting terror because of reasons of the Jordanians themselves. But thank goodness there aren't any incidents. And believe me, you're talking about 1.5 million Syrian refugees and 500,000 Iraqi refugees. Can you imagine? And they're still succeeding in fighting terror. But Jordan, in contrast to the past, in the east, there was a country that used to be Iraq, and it has now disappeared. And instead of that, there's the Anbar region. In other words, it's literally on the border of Daesh, of an Islamic State. So you can see how they burnt down in that horrific incident when they actually was an immolation of a pilot there. But I think that the tragedy, the human tragedy that we see with the refugees, of what is happening in Syria, those refugees, there are no schools, destroyed towns, infrastructures are totally in tatters. And the people that are actually sprouting up there are Al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra, and ISIS would love to get there as well. They're not acting against Israel because of our deterrence, and I think that our policy is a very good one. I haven't come here as an official sort of propaganda agent or explainer, but at least I think that we are doing the right things now. If we start going into Syria, then everyone would convene and converge together. So our deterrence is working. Whether that is a solution for 200 years, no, probably not. But at the moment it is working. Our deterrence based on a very simple principle. Don't tempt us and don't threaten us, then we won't threaten, we won't attack you in return. So as you can see, ultimately it is working because they are busy with their their internal strife and battles, and that was also analyzed before I spoke, and there are additional reasons for that as well. The deterrence is working. The risk factors are very powerful. Daesh, as you would not hesitate before using chemical warfare, but they are finding resistance against them. And because of their brutal conduct over the last years, have created a coalition where even other people like the Russians, the Americans are attacking them, and they are actually consolidating in their resistance against them because of the cruelty and their violence, and they're trying to move to a more southern area, which is near Jordan and near Israel. And Jordan has Al-Qaeda in the north and Daesh, ISIS, on the east. But look at the absurd situation. Al-Qaeda, relative to ISIS, looks like a humanitarian organization, but Assad, who is murdering millions of his own residents, and people say perhaps he's the lesser of two evils, but believe me, they're all extremely evil if we're talking about extremist, brutal, and cruel ideologies, after all. But there's a slight pleasant surprise here involved in that, and that is a threat that needs to be actually analyzed. And Al-Qaeda seems to be a little more moderate now and is less attractive to people. So the West and the Russians and everyone are actually trying to organize themselves and consolidate themselves and unite against ISIS. So when, for example, those that were shooting rockets are no longer actually continuing to do so. At any rate, vis-à-vis Syria itself, the tragedy is truly an incubator for terror, and that tragedy is the roots of it all. Now look at the map of Syria, and there are 25% that is actually controlled by them. In other words, 75 Assad has lost. 75% of Syria he has lost. So I won't go into all the nitty-gritty of the map and the various towns in Syria. But now, why is everyone trying to help him? Because they're frightened that ISIS will now overrule Damascus, and then it'll be such a decline that it'll just snowball and we'll never see the end of it. So those who live inside Syria, it is an insufferable situation. And yes, Israel is lending a hand. There are quite a number of Syrians who are being treated here in our hospitals, and that is a humanitarian aid that we are offering. But basically, Syria is in a situation of total destruction, and that's going to accompany us for many years ahead. Lebanon, if we highlight that for a moment, there are three various dimensions of the threat. There's the military dimension. It's no longer a terror one. There are 100,000 missiles that are actually being aimed at this very moment at Israel that cover the entire territory of Israel. And believe me, that is some heavy threat.
The good news is our deterrence is working, and they're busy fighting with the Sunnis, so it can take some time. But all the time, with this inner war, they continue to get armed. There are great efforts here with great success that we are making, and as far as the citizens who live in the north or Haifa or Tel Aviv, the deterrence works, they shouldn't worry. But the bad news, this is a military threat, and you know, in intelligence language, every threat has two layers. One is capability, the other one is intentions. Capabilities, it's a military threat, and it's not just to frighten anybody, but it's true. This is to the heart of the home front. It's not the front, it's the home front. But intentions, the deterrence works, but that's things that can change. Iran, and that's the main threat. We spoke so much about it. Let me just say that through this deal, it got a license to kill. 007 license to kill, resources to enhance its capabilities, and the rockets, the missiles to connect to Hezbollah. For Iran, Assad is essential. He's the link. All he has is one airport, but they can transfer weapons to Lebanon, and this is very important for them, and we have to think about it. And we do. highest order of priorities. Two, the terror dimension. Hezbollah does terror all over the world. We hear a little bit about it because they don't succeed somehow. But terror, as opposed to a military threat, you can not take responsibility, like the attack in Bulgaria. To prove that you were behind it, sometimes you have a dilemma. Such as happened, you have to maintain your intelligence capability. You can't expose them. You can't jeopardize your capability. And it's a problem. And they'll continue with terror. They will not take responsibility, and they'll continue. And this is going to be more. You don't have to be a genius for that. The third, the political. Both Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, Iraq, and Libya. It's not states. I call it a constitution without a state. You know, political science, you have states with constitution and without. There in Lebanon, they invented constitution, wonderful constitution. You read it, you're charmed. You want to go living there. It's so good. But there's no connection between the constitution and the state. There's no president in Lebanon. The only one who's valuable in Lebanon that traditionally tried to prevent. Where does he? He's no there. He doesn't exist. Why? Because Sheikh Nasrallah, who gets a salary from Iran, does not allow him to be elected. Only one, which is called Michel Rotwiz, is on the border of, I don't want to insult him, but let's say he's got various dimensions. He cannot be president in Lebanon. The government is jeopardized. The military is under pressure. The Lebanese army vis-a-vis ISIS maybe has value, but for us it's assisting Hezbollah. So these are three dimensions, and unfortunately this deal, without going into the analysis as far as terror and violence and capabilities, no doubt that if you look at the Iranian map, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, there's really like a regional system that gets momentum, backing, and resources. And this is going to happen now, from yesterday, a month ago. The moment this deal is accepted, this is it. Because the Iranians have to prove themselves. As far as we are concerned, maybe they'll be careful not to go into a military conflict, but the motivation doesn't change. It's a very extreme administration connected to nuclear weapons. Bad news. As for non-conventional terror, what happens in Syria is Assad, as a president who was elected. Okay, the majority is predetermined. At the time, I remember that the father, Assad, he wanted to raise his election from 92.4 into 92.5, and lo and behold, it happened. But okay, he's a legitimate president, but he uses chemical weapon against his own citizens. He's poisoning them with all sorts of, and now ISIS goes along with it. So red lines are crossed. It has all sorts of impacts. People have to think about it, and it's a very important subject. There's no clock here. What time? What do I? 5 minutes. Okay. There are other dark issues in the Middle East, and we whisper them. But if you look at the terrorist, the last one on the train, he was trained in Syria. In North Africa, it's one big black hole. When you say Al-Qaeda, it looks like humanitarian as opposed to the other. Both are despicable. All sorts of exotic names, but bottom line, within this rose, there's like a violent, attractive alternative that sells girls in the marketplace. They murder, they rape. It's very attractive. But in any case, North Africa is a great challenge, and that's why the importance of Egypt as a stabilizing factor is very important. One of the miracles that happened to us, you know, maybe you don't feel it, or the citizens feel it, but the security relationships. I don't want to go into details. All in all, Israel has a security back up to the Persian Gulf. It's not because of love to us, but it's mutual interests. Because these enemies, they don't distinguish between these heretics and those heretics. In Egypt, they don't distinguish. When they go towards the soldiers of the Egyptian army in Ramadan, the big Islamic holiday, they massacre them. They couldn't care less. It's just murder that continues. In other words, and I want to go back to Turkey for a minute. In Turkey, there were elections. The Turks have to do some soul searching. It cannot be that the central man who establishes terror networks is sitting in Istanbul. That's terror. Here, the mic just fell. That it should be in Istanbul. I have to say something to summarize the picture. We are in a Middle East that all the states collapsed. All the kingdoms remained. Look, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, what does it mean? The implications, prices of oil, that's a different thing. But in the meantime, the traditional systems remained. I came to the conclusion, personally, which is not accepted by many people in other places, democracy will not survive in the Middle East, but stability, that's what we need. And when you throw out an unstable administration, eventually you don't get classic democracy like in the books. You get dark forces that surface. The states themselves are collapsing. I cannot see rehabilitation of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. You have in Iraq Shiites, and in Iran you have this angry Sunnis. They go to ISIS, and then you got the Kurds who are defending themselves, and they want a state of their own. And what are they? 30 million people. This map is so complex. They're completely involved in internal conflicts. You cannot intervene. The basic name is power and strength. Not to intervene if you don't have to, but to keep your deterrence. Therefore, the picture is that the Israeli citizens recently, there were very good news as far as the success of fight against terror. You know, I compare it to diseases in the body that are painful, but the risk factor are very varied. The intelligence here has a huge mission. You know, if people shoot from Gaza or now rockets to the Galilee, who cares who was behind it, jihadis or Islamic? For the intelligence, it's a mission. They have to recommend what to do, how to do, but there's a multidimensional challenge, and it's a changing world. But what gives hope, the terror of ISIS is going out of proportion, and the world has to unite. And if it doesn't, it's going to learn it the hard way. So you see the successful coalition in the north, better intelligence, Mubarak al-Baghdadi, his deputy Mu'taz went to a better world, and so did others, etc., etc. So there are developments that are relevant. It's true that we don't have boots on the ground yet, but you have to distinguish between Iran and IS. There's a dangerous illusion as if Iran is positive and ISIS is negative. Look what's happening. Lebanon, Hezbollah is stronger than Lebanon. When weapon streams through the borders of Lebanon, what? The government of Lebanon approved it? They don't even know where the border is. Nobody pays customs. Nobody asks anything. Nasrallah, with his leadership, he approves it together with Iran. The guards, you see them in Lebanon and Yemen and in Iraq. This man represents the guards. You see all the successes in Yemen, which are supposed to be a jumping board to Saudi Arabia. This is a strategic threat. The moment they'll have the halo of nuclear, they won't even have to develop it. All they have to do is just to pretend that they have it. And under the umbrella of deterrence, what's deterrence in Iran? It means I am allowed to harm you, but you're not allowed to harm me. That's deterrence. Some of the attacks of revenge, etc., it's the same philosophy. We call it deterrence, let us live in peace. They say, I'm going to harm you, but you can't harm me. And if I attack you and I take responsibility, don't blame me because you don't have evidence. If you have evidence, expose it, and I'll be always happy to fuck, he says, the intelligence of Israel, in the words of Hezbollah. And this is a very dangerous state terror. And ISIS, of course, was established and all that. You can talk about it for hours. And at the end of the day, there's a conflict between us. And you know, there's so many dangerous factor. We are preparing ourselves towards, but the dangers are less. But it doesn't mean that the risk factors, unless you take care of them, will not become more hazardous.